In this discussion on interfaith dialogue, I define interfaith dialogue using David Smoke's definition when he says, at its most basic, interfaith dialogue is a simple concept, persons of faith meeting to have a conversation, but the character of the conversation and the purpose of having the conversation are not simple to describe or categorize, since they cover a variety of types. Now, having seen David Smoke's definition of interfaith dialogue, I want to say that there are three dimensions of religious phenomenon. That includes institutional dimension, experiential dimension, metaphysical dimension. And in understanding the institutional dimension, we note that it refers to the teachings and activities of synagogues, churches, mosques, and other places of worship. While experiential dimension has to do with the life of faith, the sense of transcendence, the role of confession, love, and forgiveness. While metaphysical dimension of religious phenomenon has to do with the primordial structures of meaning that are common to human experience and which is expressed in myths, stories, and rituals. Now, concerning the general characteristics of conflict and principles of conflict resolution, which goes hand in hand with religious or interfaith dialogue, may I say that at the heart of most conflicts is an issue of justice. That is, an issue of one or more parties feeling they have been wronged or dealt with unfairly, discriminated against, violated, or denied their legitimate rights. Another characteristic of conflict resolution or principles of conflict resolution is to do with the fact that conflicts at every level involve people. So they are people when they are conflicts. Whether we are dealing with ideological or geopolitical conflicts, with the disagreement over territory, or with diverging ethnic, religious, or racial claims, we are dealing with people, with human beings, with fears and anxieties, hopes and dreams. That principles of conflict resolution characteristically, we need to appreciate that behind the slogans, positions, and claims of every party involved in conflict, there are interests and needs. The challenge is to discover what these interests and needs are and which ones might be shared by both sides of the conflict. Another point to consider when looking at the principles of conflict resolution is that for the eventual healing of any given community, honesty about the past is mandatory. You cannot escape honesty. And this is a difficult issue because there is fear of prosecution and other legal implications. But the public disclosure of what happened in the past, that is truth-telling, is typically viewed as a prerequisite for genuine healing. Last, most violent conflicts involve a vicious cycle of recrimination, retribution, and revenge. For the most part, this kind of cycle can be broken when at least one party is willing to admit to faults and confess to failings. This, however, is rare happening. But when it does happen, when we get people who are willing to admit faults and confess to failings, to their respective failings, a new dynamic can take place. A miracle is bound to happen. And that is one that is able to break the vicious cycle of violence and allow for healing and give room to healing to take place. The next thing to consider is the varieties of interfaith dialogues. I want to consider 4. That is dialogue of experts, dialogue of experience, dialogue of action, and dialogue of life. I want to start with the dialogue of life. In this dialogue, participants are more concerned with issues that pertain to daily living, issues to do with common interest in the community, and issues to do with common values that bind each of the participants together. In regard to dialogue of action, in this dialogue of action, this dialogue involves a greater emphasis on social justice and the value of working together on a common project in order to make a contribution to the community. You may take, for example, the participant in the dialogue of action. They will collaborate together to fight HIV and AIDS, poor health. They'll fight homelessness. They'll fight poverty, among other things. And participants in this dialogue of action assert that action against injustice is the strongest expression of faith. Coming to the third variety of interfaith dialogue, let me say that the dialogue of experience stresses how faith people experience their faith on daily basis. That's why it is called dialogue of experience. Participants in this dialogue are interested in the human expression and experiential aspect of a faith and how an individual of another faith understands the holy in his or her life. There is a desire to understand a personal interpretation of faith instead of a textbook version of conviction. Regarding the dialogue of experts, the fourth one, it is called the dialogue of expert or expert dialogue because it involves participants interested in theology and philosophy of the faith traditions. Participants will center their dialogues in text and doctrines, and the dialogue often reflects a process of mutual theological inquiry. Something else very critical is to determine and appropriate modality. Now, These four modalities of dialogue provide a framework for students of interfaith dialogue. It is critical, first, to understand the modality of the interfaith dialogue and assess the dialogic assets and weaknesses of the participants. By first assessing the participants' objectives in the interfaith dialogue, one can decide on the appropriate dialogue modality to implement and which approach will best cater to dialogue participants. First, determine the optimal duration of the effort. By clarifying objectives in this way, that is, determining the optimal duration of the effort, dialogue organizers can determine the optimal structure and duration of the effort. Sustained impact usually requires a long-term commitment. One-time dialogue sessions are often of only limited value. A series of sessions is desirable, along with follow-up activities. The next is select an appropriate venue. Select an area that is agreeable to all people, meaning appropriate value. Now, interfaith dialogue can take place in place where we have agreeable venue or place of meeting. The space and time of dialogues can shape the way members begin to understand one another. It is important that organizers of interfaith dialogues first discuss whether they want neutral spaces or shared spaces in their respective institutions. You don't have to decide for them or dominate them or assume they are not thinking. Consult them to know what is the appropriate or befitting place. Another very critical area to consider is the criteria in selecting participants in interfaith dialogue. 3 points to consider here. First, assess leadership qualities. In other words, interfaith dialogue is frequently organized by those in each community who are eager to reach out beyond their own group to connect with those in other faith communities. The second criteria in selecting participants in interfaith dialogue is be careful of extremists. Those fundamentalists are not welcome. Be careful with them, those handling position, those with handling stand. For interfaith dialogue is possible when leaders understand such activity to be consistent with the fundamental values of their faith traditions. A severe limitation of interfaith dialogue is that many faith groups are not willing to participate, either because of dictates of their faith regarding interactions with members of other faith communities, or because of the level of animosity they hear or they bear to want the other religious group. Unfortunately, it is these groups that are often the chief protagonists in the conflict. It is primarily extremists who create interfaith conflict, but they are rarely willing to engage in dialogue. Now, their encounters with the other communities are more likely to be confrontational. The last criteria in selecting participants in interfaith dialogue is consider a range of participants. A range of participants. Consider many participants, a range of participants. For dialogue should not be confined to clerics. The most promising participants are those with potential to develop a commitment to peaceful coexistence and mutual enlightenment. For the role of women as potential religious peacemakers needs to be recognized. There are those patriarchal societies who ignore women in terms of conflict, and this is a big mistake because women and children suffer more when there are conflicts. So women should be taken as a critical pillar in these endeavors. Another thing outside the three criteria in selecting participants in interfaith dialogue we should give out here is you can also consider meeting separately. Don't just meet at once. You can meet with a few radicals or few extremists and try to kind of come up with a certain framework of working. Yeah, because organizers of interfaith dialogues must be attentive to these concerns and challenges because they inhibit participants from freely exploring their potential in dialogue. It may be advisable for faith communities to meet separately first, to lead honest discussions prior to any commitment to interfaith dialogue, to explore the participants' positions on controversial issues, to establish group identity, and most importantly, to ensure that their religious leadership is involved with this dialogue. Another thing to consider is learning from the other or learning about the other. The other may mean the other group. Typically, dialogues focus initially on learning about the other. Once preparatory issues have been addressed, and in many cases, groups have held separate meetings, the groups then come together for the first time and the dialogue begins. Another thing to consider in these interfaith dialogues is to explore similarities and difference amongst the two antagonistic groups. The dialogue can explore both the similarities among the participating faiths and the core differences that divide them. Members of opposing religious communities are frequently unaware of the components of their faiths that are shared. To explore these shared commitments and beliefs can be illuminating and provide a basis for fruitful dialogue. Interfaith dialogue can productively focus on exploring the concept of peace and the nature of spirituality in the participating faith traditions. The last point is we need shared sacred text. We need to consider about sharing sacred text when handling interfaith dialogue. Participants can read sacred text to educate, inform, and achieve deeper understanding of each other and in turn enhance interfaith relations. This also builds awareness of textual linkages that exist among the faith traditions, particularly evident in the three Abrahamic traditions or religions. You know, Abrahamic religions are Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and eventually expand opportunities for cultivating interfaith linkages and identity.